So welcome. This is office hours for week 25 for ChinaX. I'm Mark Elliott, and with me today is Grace Jackson. And Grace, you may remember from some of the earlier modules at the very beginning of part 6 of ChinaX. Grace was responsible for helping to create some of those modules, or all of those modules, and we brought her back here to take part in today's office hours. Hi, Grace.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Good. So we have some announcements, some responses to general feedback. Grace, some students seem to be having trouble with the drag and drop question.
That's right. So we have some advice for you just with regards to drag and drop questions in the future. Please try to use Chrome or Safari as your browser, and try not to use an iPad because the drag and drop questions will not work well with an iPad. We'd just like to emphasize that to answer these questions, you have to drag the A, B, or C icons to the corresponding image, not the other way around.
So we're now in about halfway through, a little more than halfway through the modules for the Qing. Tomorrow will be Peter Bohl's turn again. We'll bring Professor Bohl back. He has a module on the scholars, the great 18th century social satire on the examination system.
Also for this module, you're going to get to use an exciting new text annotation tool and image annotation tool, which we've been developing.
Cool.
Which should be great. And
what's the image going to be?
You've seen a tiny bit of it before in this past module on Manchu identity. When we talk about the attraction of Chinese cities, I think you see a little bit of this. It's the scroll called Prosperous Suzhou, which is huge. I don't know exactly how long
Many
it
meters
is.
long. I don't know.
But it's huge and very detailed and very rich. So you're going to get to work with that this week with Professor Bohl.
And there'll be some reading associated with that, and then the week after that we close up with one more module on the Qing. So we had a lot of great follow-up questions this week. Again, I continue to be so impressed by the responses here. There's no way we could address all of them. There's one. Actually, there's one. I'll start with an easy question. This question about Putonghua. What's Putonghua anyway?
Putonghua, as I understand it, is modern standard Mandarin. So it's the language that is understood throughout China, but not necessarily spoken throughout China. It's the official national language of China.
Yeah, the common literally means common speech, right? So this is the spoken standard Chinese. And somebody has written, is modern Putonghua a Manchu byproduct? I read somewhere about a contemporary Han Chinese complaining that the Manchus had changed the tones. Did they reduce the number of tones to 4 from several more that Cantonese has? And this is an interesting question. The answer to this question is no. The Manchus did not change the tones. It's a bit more complicated than that. There are more tones in Cantonese, and we believe that there were other tones in Middle Chinese spoken, say, before the year 1000 or so. During the long period of division between the North and the South that starts from around 900 and then ends with the Ming, there is a real divergence in the way that the language is spoken in the North, where the older tones, like Rusheng, were dropped. This is why in Southern Chinese you will have endings of words that have a K in them sometimes.
Right.
Those are dropped in Northern Chinese. But that has to do, there are all kinds of linguists talk about that a lot. Those changes were almost certainly already in place by the time the Manchus came around. It may have had more to do with the effects of interaction with other northern peoples, however, not the Manchus, in earlier centuries.
And that is why in Taiwan, Taiwanese Hokkien, you still have Rusheng and other things that have survived.
Right, so sometimes people who are Cantonese speakers will tell you that their version of Chinese, of spoken Chinese, is purer, they will say. It is older, in fact. It retains more artifacts of, phonetically, of older older pronunciations of Chinese. Whether it's pure or not, well, that's a question for other people to decide. What else here do you think makes sense for us to discuss here?
I was interested to see that somebody had asked about women, about our discussion of women in this section. And although we don't know these are anonymous comments, so we don't know who has asked this, but this person mentioned that there was some mention that they had more freedom of movement than Han Chinese women. This is Manchu women. And can we have some more information about women's roles, lifestyles, and contributions to society?
So this points to something that I think, as we continue to work on ChinaX, we'll want to do more of, probably, which is to include more things from a gender perspective and on women. Very briefly here, it's certainly the case that Manchu women enjoyed greater freedoms than Han women did, even in the upper classes. An upper-class Han woman was really not supposed to leave the house, certainly not supposed to leave the house unaccompanied. And she was not supposed to visit temples, she wasn't supposed to go visit fairs. We know, of course, that women did do these things. Very often, some of the stories that we have, we know that they did them, and not just stories, also memoirs, in male disguise. They would dress up as men and then go to the temple and see what all the fun was about. But by and large, travel and life outside the family compound was very limited for most women in the Qing and in the Ming as well. But Manchu women were not subject to those same sorts of restrictions, and this probably has something to do with, in general, with the different economic expectations of women in steppe societies or semi-nomadic societies, where men would often be away for extended periods of time, and women were the ones who tended the animals, who did a lot of work outside of the home. So their reputation was of being much more freewheeling, mobile. Even in the Qing, we have, for example, records from Koreans who regularly visited Beijing, and they were shocked to see banner women riding horses in the streets of Beijing. I was
going to ask if Manchu women ever rode or,
definitely.
Or learned how to shoot arrows.
We've seen some images of that, right? So definitely so.
Great.
As far as their roles, lifestyles, and contributions to society, women, of course, are not able to take part in the most important activity for public society, which is the examination system. But in terms of their ability to take part in cultural life, women are writing like crazy in the Qing. Actually, this came up last week in office hours with Peter Bohl, and they're publishing a huge amount of poetry, especially. And they also have a great effect on things, it seems, through their influence on their sons, who are office holders very often, or famous men, who then write about their mothers. So that's an indirect role that they play. This is not to speak, of course, of powerful women like the Empress Dowager, whom you'll get to meet next fall when Professor Kirby talks about the very late Qing. But there was a woman who you certainly wouldn't want to cross, for sure.
Yeah, we saw a photograph of her in this module.
That's right. That's right. Now, there's one other question I think we have time for here. The student writes in, I would have liked to have had more explanation as to why, for instance, allowing Confucianism and Buddhism was seen as a acculturation and not just interpreted as a pragmatic decision to aid their control and government because they themselves still believed in shamanism. This is a very interesting point, because typically in earlier interpretations of the deployment of different ideologies by the Qing court, it was assumed that the adoption of Confucian modes of expression and practice and performance were seen as evidence of acculturation, if not assimilation, by the Qing. But that Qing patronage, for instance, of Tibetan Buddhism, which was extremely active, was not acculturation.
Right.
It was pragmatic manipulation, instrumentally brought to take care of political problems. And so that view is now quite, I think we look at it quite differently. I think there is acculturation when it comes to Tibetan Buddhism. We know that a number of Manchus were interested in Buddhism. There were, not a lot, but there were some monks in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries who were Manchus. Most were Mongols, especially in Beijing. They're mostly Mongols and some Tibetans. And they were able to combine all of these things, right, into a single, what made for them sense in their lives.
And the idea that acculturation, that we would not call Manchu patronage of Tibetan Buddhism acculturation, but we would call Manchu adoption of certain Confucian ideologies as acculturation. Do you think that reflects a kind of underlying cultural prejudice?
Yeah, I think it reflects a kind of underlying Sinocentric view of things,
right,
where the adoption of Chinese ways, this is an authentic movement towards civilization. This is the transformation of the other to be more like us, whereas the adoption of others, the other ways of others, well, no, that's not part of what we would expect according to traditional notions of what happens when the quote barbarian other comes into contact with Chinese civilization.
Right.
So there's another part of this question: can a language really completely reflect a nation's culture? It's a really thoughtful question, and connected here to some concerns about, what difference does it make in reading Qing documents that are written in Manchu as opposed to in Chinese, and what does that really get you? And we had actually a lot of responses to that. It was one of the questions that we asked people to write back to. Most people seem to think that it made a lot of sense to learn Manchu. And I want to emphasize again that reading the Manchu documents doesn't give you access to some sort of pure and unadulterated true vision or anything. Manchu documents, just like Chinese documents or documents written in any language, English or French or whatever language you like, are subject to all sorts of conditions in terms of who wrote it and why they wrote it and whom they wrote it for and all of that sort of thing. But it is another source. It's another wavelength to tune in our radio to the past and hear what that broadcast sounds like. It's more information. Can a language completely reflect a nation's culture? What do you think about that?
I think certainly not. But for me, as I so often do, I think back to my experience in Taiwan, where I spent 2 years, and in Taiwan, language is quite a significant marker, I think, of not ethnic identity, but cultural identity. And what was interesting for me to see there was that Taiwanese Hokkien, or Taiwanhua, is not a written language. It's spoken in homes and spoken in markets, and yet it is still such a salient marker for Taiwanese identity. And I was just wondering about the tensions between, well, the Manchu decision to create a script so that they could leave an alternative or complementary documentary record versus the kind of smaller, more fragmentary regional dialects that are so often markers of cultural identity.
So in terms of the dialect differences that you're referring to, a number of anthropologists have actually worked on this topic, and they're not comfortable calling these differences ethnic,
right,
for reasons that are easy to understand. But they call them sub-ethnic.
Right.
Sub-ethnic. So there are different ways of being Chinese, as we know. If you spend any time in China, if you're Chinese yourself, you're speaking with somebody who's from Shanghai or from Taiwan or Hong Kong or Sichuan or Shanxi, you can usually tell where people are from. Just as when you're from the UK, you listen to an accent, it's easy for you I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm wrong, to tell if somebody's from the Midlands or if they're from Yorkshire or if they're from Cornwall or wherever they might be from. So these kinds of markers are clearly very, very important. They're not a complete reflection, but they're one important reflection, I think, to bring to bear. As for the Manchus, well, I think that the creation of the script was really it was a bureaucratic decision, that they needed something to keep records. And only later did the idea of this being something that we should be proud of, our script, which did become quite a pronounced thing in some of the prefaces to the Manchu dictionaries, for instance. You see the emperor going on about what a beautiful language Manchu is. It reflects the sounds, represents the sounds much better than Chinese, that kind of stuff.
But interestingly, one thing that we do mention in this past module is that by the 1800s, Manchu is a language that you do not hear on the streets of Beijing anymore.
Not so much.
We touch on the kind of loss of language as a marker of Manchu identity, but we don't really go into much more detail than that.
Right, because we're not going to really get into the 1800s much in this lecture, or in this part of the course, part 6. It's still unclear to me exactly how little Manchu was spoken in the 19th century. We know some of the great translations, actually, of one of the great translations of the Strange Tales from the Liao Studio, the Liao Zhaizhi Manchu translation. This was done in the 1830s. It was done very late. It's written in beautiful Manchu, and it was done for pleasure. So there were clearly, and there were still stories. We even have I was reading a diary with students last semester, written by a bannerman in the early 1900s. So it doesn't go away completely, and there is still a lot of attachment.
Is there a decrease in the number of Manchu documents through the 19th century?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We had one other question here. Did the Manchus perceive themselves as having changed? Did the Han perceive the Manchus as having changed? Or is this all just academics looking at things and making up stories? And here, this is a valid question, I think, absolutely. And we can say that, yes, the Manchus did perceive that things had changed. We can look, for instance, at the writings of Lao She, one of the great 20th century prose stylists in Chinese. Lao She was Manchu. And wrote a lot about life in Beijing when he was growing up, which was in the very waning years of the Qing dynasty and early years of the Republic. And he was aware of the fact that, yeah, his ancestors had been warriors, they'd been tough and mean and all of that kind of thing, but that one of his uncles, for instance, who was in the Imperial Guard, couldn't even shoot a bow. So he was much better at raising birds in bird cages. So yeah, there was definitely a self-perception that things had changed, and the Han were also very much aware of that too. So this is not entirely, I think, something that's only evident to us today. It was evident to people then.
And did any Han become culturally Manchu?
Certainly in the early Qing that happened a fair amount, but because it was not supposed to happen, it was not legal, people try to hide it. So it's hard to find cases, but I have discovered some cases of that.
Interesting.
Happening, yeah.
Of them learning how to ride and shoot.
Yeah,
and
ride,
hunt.
shoot, speak Manchu, the whole works. So we should move on now to the discussion question that we have.
So really the question this week was to do with the main topic of the module, which was ethnicity, ethnic identity. And to sum up, we asked learners, do you agree that ethnicity is a socially constructed phenomenon that changes over time, but that is kind of universal in human society? Or do you think that it is primordial, fixed, and unchanging? And also, we asked whether ethnicity is modern. Is it a product of modernity? And we got a lot of very interesting responses, some really detailed analysis.
Yeah, I was also struck by how personal many of the responses were, where people were reflecting on their own identities many of which were mixed identities, or they were talking about their parents or grandparents or earlier ancestors. And this made it really relevant, I think, for a lot of people.
Right.
The majority seems to feel, the overwhelming majority seem to agree that ethnicity is not fixed, that it is something that evolves, that changes over time, that is very much dependent on context and historical situations. One of the best quotations here, Marga S.V. Writes, she says, or he, "I agree. The Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset says, yo soy, yo y mis circunstancias," pardon for the mispronunciation, which means I am me and my circumstances. So this is a very, obviously, circumstantialist understanding of how identity gets made, but that seems to really capture a lot of what people were what the consensus was. There were some who believed that ethnicity was primordial, but my sense was that in saying primordial, what people were really talking about was that there needed to be some kind of notion of real genealogical or descent connection. That culture is a big part of it, but it's not just culture. I mean, you and I both study Chinese culture. We would never claim to be ethnically Chinese. There needs to be some kind of blood or genetic claim that can plausibly be made at the same time as there are some of the cultural markers and sometimes physical markers. And physical markers don't always go together with genetic markers. That really depends on things like skin color, which is one thing that people talked about, and there was some discussion here about the difference between race and ethnicity that we probably can't really get into, but the short answer seems to be, among anthropologists anyway, who study this, and sociologists, that race is ethnicity, but with skin color added in, and other very distinctive somatic features such as hair color or eye color or stuff like that. And one of the questions we had actually is, how come we were asked whether were there physical differences between Manchus and Chinese. In other words, could a Manchu who was speaking Chinese be taken for a Chinese person? And the answer to that is maybe yes, maybe no. That we don't have a lot of discussion about the physical appearance of Manchus by Chinese at this time. Some observers, foreign observers, make some comments about Manchu faces being somewhat different, cheekbones being different, stature, they're larger in stature. But again, these generalizations are very hard to really, it's hard to know what to do with them.
And would you say that in, for example, the accession portraits of the Qing emperors, or the early Qing emperors, you see a kind of somatic distinctiveness in the faces?
Well, the thing is that if this is where we get back to the problem of ethnicity and descent, because none of us is pure anything, right? And that was true for Manchus as well. Even the Manchu emperors, you might think, as being the most Manchu of all Manchus, but the Manchu emperors had plenty of Mongolian ancestry as well as Han ancestry, because some of there are imperial mothers who were in the Han banners. So they were not Han civilians, but they were Han who had been in the banners. So there's no pure Manchu blood. So ethnicity is not just blood either. It's one of these combinations that is, it's hard to be really scientific about. And here the comment from Nat from SF I really liked. This was in response to James 711, who provides some very nice comments from Harold Isaacs about what ethnicity is. And James 711 says that I can say that ethnicity is primordial, fixed, and unchanging, based on the Manchus themselves, who did not see themselves as Han, did not acculturate, and did not assimilate the Han culture. But, of course, the Manchus did acculturate, and some did assimilate. So I may not have been as clear as I should have been here, but Nat from SF says, I propose that ethnicity is like art. You know it when you see it. So that, again, is something that suggests that ethnicity is a transaction, that it's a deal we make, that you say you are who you are, and I go along with that, and you give me credit for also being who I am. And there's a deal here that we make, and we both get something out of that. It's not always the most important factor in things, and there may be political or economic gain one way or another in some situations where we want to play up ethnicity, and other situations where we want to play it down. It is something that people use. Right?
I suppose with the idea that ethnicity is like art, that you know it when you see it, for me that implies that ethnicity is something that is almost, that we intuit, that we have an intuitive sense of our own ethnic identities and other people's ethnic identities. It doesn't necessarily suggest that we are kind of constantly differentiating ourselves. And I like that definition.
Yeah.
I like that way of thinking about it.
So do you think that it's modern? We had some responses here, like what you're saying now. Is this curiosity about who we are, is this a modern thing?
I think to talk about whether this is a modern thing, it's useful to think about, I can't remember who mentioned globalization, but I do think that in our age we have to consider the ways in which our awareness of the global community, the international community, is shaping how we identify ourselves.
Right, so here's a question, and we're not going to answer it here, but we had many people say that they thought that with increased globalization that people were less aware of ethnicity, that it didn't matter so much because people are meeting people from all over the world, they're getting married, it's all getting mixed up. So ethnicity is going away. Other people said that they thought that with globalization, people are much more aware of ethnicity. They become much more aware of difference. So this is something to think about. Again, we can see evidence for both points of view. Du Bois-Halbe says, in the age of genetic code, I think we're too anxious to address questions of ethnicity in terms of a rigid set of physical characteristics that somehow shape political and social habits and behavior from generation to generation. And I think that there is that sort of assumption that, well, there's got to be some, if you're not pure something, then you're not really whatever it is that you say you are. If you don't speak the language, you're not really who you say you are. And certainly Manchus today in China face this issue. We had some responses from people who identified as Manchu, but they once said, I'm Manchu, but I don't know what makes me Manchu, because I don't speak the language.
Well, I think for me that points to the idea that what we were saying earlier, globalization is making race less relevant and perhaps cultural identity, ethnic identity more relevant.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, this is a process that will take a long time to work out, and I think in different parts of the world.
But some people think we are in a kind of post-racial state at the moment, a post-racial society.
Some people say that. I don't see it myself, but it would be nice someday to be in that kind of a world, I think. At least insofar as it would reduce conflict in many places.
Do you not think that
discrimination,
globalization in its kind of material form, like with global brands and consumerism, is creating a sense that people can partake in other people's cultures and
I think that it's sitting here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's very easy to think that that's true. Or many of the other cities, if you go to Beijing or Tokyo or London, sure, that's how it looks. But I think there are lots and lots of places where that's not how it looks at all, actually. We probably need to wrap up. I'm going to end here. I think we can end here with not a hero. I'm happy to see, agrees with my formulation that ethnicity is not fixed, but is the result of a social process, the outcome of a dynamic between perceptions of self and other. Difficult to predict and even analyze, how it's going to, how it's all going to work out. And then Not a Hero goes on to talk about the Normans and the Normans who become assimilated. And this made me think again about the particular situation of the Manchus in the 19th century, which we were talking about a minute ago. And what would have happened if the Manchus had taken over China and ruled, say, 800 years ago? Would they have been assimilated the way that many Jurchens were assimilated? Those who didn't return
Right.
to the Northeast were in fact assimilated. And to what degree did the arrival on the intellectual scene and the political scene in China of modern nationalism from the West through Japan in China sort of changed the process of acculturation that was going on, and had it lasted another 50 years, and had there been, if there were no such thing as the nation state, ideas of the nation state and nationalism, would that process of acculturation have ended in assimilation ultimately? Because the Normans did pretty much melt into the broader Anglo-Saxon population. Do people still talk about Norman ancestry in England today?
No, I've never heard that discussed.
Yeah, and you don't really talk about people today with ancestors who are Khitans anymore, or Jurchens. Although there was a paper actually at a conference I was at this weekend who talked about a family that claimed to be Tangut, of Tangut descent, going back many, many centuries. So it's hard to say. There's still more work to be done here. Anyway, thank you again very much for your thoughtful responses, and I'm grateful also to Grace for taking time to come back and join us here again. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Won't be around for the next office hours, but we'll be back again after that. Bye-bye.
Bye.